I'm someone that's really interested in a lot of gender issues, and like I tag Husang Oppa in articles that talks about pornography and articles that talks about women's rights every day, and he has to read them because I'm gonna nag him. 오빠 그거 봤어요 동영상? 그거 동영상. 그거 타임머신. 그러니까 이렇게 nag를 해서 he has to watch the things I tell him to watch. But because I'm interested in women's rights, I actually took a lot of courses in school because I come from Ewha Women's University, and obviously the most famous studies in my school is women's studies. 여성학 이런 거니까. I took courses at school, and I realized that approaching feminism as an academic subject is actually not the same as approaching feminism as a debate topic. And if I talk about feminism as an academic subject, then I think probably I'll have to talk for hours and hours in maybe like the entire semester. So the scope of what I'm going to talk about today isn't very relevant to feminism in a academia sense, but it has more to do with feminism and debates about feminism that you guys are going to have in debate tournaments. And it's actually quite simple and it's easy. I think feminism debates are one of the most easy debates out there. And the reason is because feminism debates are known as cookie cutters. Maybe some of you have heard of this phrase, maybe it's the first time hearing for some of you. When a debate is a cookie cutter, it means that whenever a feminism motion comes out, the same framework in approaching the debate can be applied every time. So if you know how to do one feminism debate, then you can pretty much do all feminism debates. And that is why it actually doesn't require much matter or doesn't require a lot of like fancy knowledge in order for you to do a feminism debate well, and that's why I think it's easy and straightforward and simple. And maybe at the end of today's lecture, you guys will all become like experts in feminism debates. And at KNC, 막 KDS 1 win, KDS 2 win, KDS 3 win, maybe, I hope. So I'm gonna first tell you the structure of what I'm gonna talk about. We're recording this right now, right? Yeah. So I'll tell you the structure first, and I'm gonna use the board today. So. I'm gonna divide my lecture into 4 segments, and the 4 segments are, number 1, talking about feminism debates as a choice debate, and number 2, talking about feminism debates as a debate about different contexts, and number 3, talking about feminism debates in discussing ideologies, and then thirdly, talking about feminism as a movement. And I think if you understand these 4 things, basically, it's gonna cover you in like 90% of all feminism debates. I can't say 100% because debates are never about absolute things, but I think you'll be ready for most motions. And after discussing all 4 of these things, we're gonna practice with a lot of different motions. And EDiS told you to like build cases on motions, right? I'm assuming that everyone did it. 약간 그 웃음의 의미가 뭔지는 모르겠지만 yeah, so we're gonna discuss motions, and if you're not ready, don't worry, you know, you have EDiS who will cover everything for you. And at the end of discussing each of these parts, I'll open the floor for questions if there are any, so you guys can ask me questions if you have any at the end of each section. So let's talk about feminism debate as choice debates first. Because I think all feminism debates are ultimately debates that try to prove that your side is the side that is maximizing choice for women. I think this is the same for all minority debates, because basically when we say that minorities don't get to enjoy certain rights or women don't get to enjoy certain rights, the rights that we're talking about is actualization of choice. For example, the choice to do something that is maybe tabooed in society. Like for example, a lot of girls here are going to agree that 막 술자리에서 술을 마시고 있으면 guys can 막 색드립 쳐도 nobody's gonna think that that's weird or that's wrong. But when girls do it openly, they're frowned upon. And they're like slut shamed. They're called like slutty, and 무슨 여자가 막 그런 소리에 이런 소리 듣고, right? I think a lot of people will be able to empathize with that. I think that ultimately talks about your ability to make choices in certain situations. And the reason why this is relevant to guys as well is because, for example, when you're watching a sad movie, you're a guy and you're watching a sad movie and you're crying, and people tell you, 아, 남자가 무슨 슬픈 영화 보고 울어, 막 사내 자식이 왜 이런 거 보고 울어라고 하면 basically your right to make a choice upon what actions you want to live in your everyday life or what kind of identity you want to pursue is being limited. And that is why feminism debates are ultimately about choice and maximizing that choice. And oftentimes we're not even talking about these small, like everyday things. We're talking about more important things. Like, for example, I want to get a job in a certain field that is dominated by males, and therefore my choice to take on a certain profession is limited. Then you can obviously call that an infringement of my fundamental rights. That is more severe than my right to talk freely about sex in social settings, right? So all those things ultimately point to the idea of why choice is so important. And in debates, in feminism debates, where population side and opposition side both try to talk about and prove why your side is the side that is bringing the most amount of choice for women, the contention is not on whether you are upholding choice or whether you go against the idea of choice. Because no debater will ever come up to the podium and say, we're against choice for women. Nobody's going to say that, right? So everyone agrees in the debate that you're all trying to go for this idea of choice, but the contention basically are twofold. Number one, how to understand the world that we're currently living in. That's the first contention. And number two is, what tactic are we going to use in fighting those social problems? And these will be discussed later, because what world are we living in basically deals with the context, and what method are we going to do? Are we going to use in fighting problems basically has to do with the movement part. So we'll discuss that later. But basically in showing those different things, you try to prove that your side is the side that best upholds more choice for women. Because based on your understanding of what society we're living in, you should obviously carry out different tactics to maximize choice for women, right? So to kind of get you to understand directly what we mean by general choice debates, we're actually going to talk about a specific motion. And I heard that 여기서 그 newbie가 누구죠? SRT 갔던 분들? Who's the team that won?
You didn't come.
Too bad. SRT final motion이 this also legalized prostitution이었다고 들었는데, right? Did you guys all watch the debate?
That was the very first one.
아, round 1 보셨어요? 아, 그래? 알았어. 근데 지금 대회 직전에 호정이가 I heard she gave a lecture on prostitution, right? What was the wording of the motion that you based your lecture on?
The House would support prostitution in developing countries.
So the motion that I brought today is a little bit different. The House believes that prostitution is immoral. So the issue is same. We're talking about prostitution, we're talking about women's rights, we're talking about choice, but the frame of the motion is different. So can anyone tell me how, when you're approaching this House believes that prostitution is immoral, how your approach for this motion would be different from your approach to this House would legalize prostitution? Can anyone volunteer? 아무도 안 하면 니엘이가 하고, 니엘도 모르면 효상 오빠가 하고. 뭐야? 공부해 오라 그랬는데. 야. Okay. How about any other ideas on how? Because I think there are several differences. So anything else? Yeah.
If you're talking about legalizing it, then it'd be a debate of like 장점 단점. But this is more about right or wrong. So put in differences.
Yeah. Maybe one more person. How about you? 안경 쓰신 헤드비트. basically, yes, you're all right. When you're talking about prostitution as a moral debate, it's different in that instead of it being a policy debate, it's a value judgment debate, right? We can all agree on that. And because it's a value judgment debate rather than a policy debate, the way in which you're building your case has to be different. Because, for example, if we're talking about a policy debate of the South would legalize prostitution, if it's this, and I think this is useful tip for when you're doing other debates as well on policy. Basically, your case for the proposition side is going to have two components. Number one, choice maximization. And talking about why prostitution is a legitimate profession, like all other jobs out there. Why the choice to sell your body and attach a monetary value upon your body is fundamentally really no different from all other occupations out there. That's going to be the first part, but the second part is going to be harm minimization. And here, because you're approaching it from a policy aspect, you basically talk about how even if, let's assume that prostitution isn't a great thing, it's a bad thing, and it sometimes affects women in bad ways, or society in bad ways, even if that's the case, as long as demand exists, supply will always exist. So rather than having it underground, it's better for the state to regulate it. That's basically the idea behind harm minimization, right? So that's going to be the general contentions or general ideas that proposition side will push for if this motion is a policy motion. However, if this motion is a value debate, then these things become less relevant in the debate because you're not making any kind of policy. You're just gauging whether gauging your idea of what morality ultimately is and whether prostitution fits into that criteria or not. So I think in a value judgment debate about this, proposition can also generally talk about two things. And both of the arguments that I would build as a proposition side for DeSauce believes that prostitution is immoral would directly be relevant to the idea of choice. Because number one, I would talk about, I would ask the question of are prostitutes able to make a meaningful consent? And consent is a synonym for choice, right? So here, I would first focus on the perspective of the people that are selling their own bodies, the prostitutes, and I would argue that the choice that they're making is actually not a valid choice because in a lot of circumstances, they are pushed into the prostitution industry due to circumstances like lack of education or lack of other viable financial means to sustain their life, right? So that's what pushes them into this type of industry. But here's a second level of analysis under this question that I personally like. Let's assume that I'm a prostitute and I'm working in the prostitution industry. But I'm like a 10%? I'm a 잘 나가는 prostitute. Let's assume that, right? And 그래서 막 어떤 사람이 엄청 비싼 돈을 주면서 자기랑 같이 호텔에 가자고 저한테 얘기를 했어요. 그래서 갔는데 알고 보니까 지금 이 얘기를 하는 건 효성 오빠 told me to tell you a lot of shocking things. 그래서 이 얘기하는 거예요. And he told me to say this. 그래서 호텔에 갔는데 my customer이 알고 보니까 he has a fetish. You guys all know what fetishes are, right? Fetish가 있는데 his fetish is 약간 시체랑 하는 거 좋아하는 사람이에요. 알고 보니까 my customer. 그래서 he tells me 이 그 bathtub를 얼음으로 가득 채운 다음에 거기에 30분 동안 누워 있어라. 그러면 너 몸이 차가워질 거니까 그런 다음에 나랑 관계를 갖자. Or my customer is someone that likes BDSM. You know? 그 뭐냐? 그 영화 뭐지? 50 Shades of Grey, right? Like the movie. Like he likes finding and like hitting 그런 거 좋아하는 사람이어서 he tells me I'm gonna tie you up and I'm like no and he's like but I paid for you so you have to do what I want you to do. Well, I'm like, okay, fine. And I get tied up. But what happens after I get tied up maybe is outside my boundary of control because I'm already tied up and I can't resist. I can't do anything about it, right? So even if women enter the prostitution industry willingly and with consent, maybe when we consider what happens after I enter the prostitution industry, what happens in that gray area of the room or brothel between me and the customer, I really can't say that I'm making a consent or I'm making an informed choice every time that situation happens. In me engaging with that change, right? Change between my body and that person's money. But the assumption here was that I'm a 10%, 나는 잘 나가는 예쁜 prostitute. That was the assumption. But let's assume that I'm a prostitute in my late 30s and I'm really ugly. And I'm like overused. My body is overused. Then obviously, I'm not going to have much market value, right? So maybe when I'm in my early 20s and I'm young and I'm beautiful, maybe I can have the luxury to choose, 이 커스터머를 너무 더럽게 생겼으니까 이 사람이랑은 안 할래. 이 커스터머 너무 나이가 많으니까 이 사람이랑은 안 할래. 이런 식으로 maybe I can have that luxury. But as I become older or as I am from the start not a very attractive person, then maybe I can't even have that luxury to choose my customers or be choosy in those circumstances. And that proves that prostitutes really don't have that luxury to make a choice in a lot of different circumstances. And therefore, if we ask the question of whether it is a meaningful consent that these women are making in that circumstance, the answer probably will be no. And then I think the second thing I would talk about in this case would be, 시간 보고 있죠? 왜냐면 제가 아이유 콘서트를 가기로 했는데 8시부터 티켓 발매여서 미리 있으면 또 가는 사람 있어요 여기에? The second question is, does it create social harm? Because when we're discussing what morality is, ultimately it's not completely different from standards of legality. Standards of morality and standards of legality are not things that are completely separate because our government makes laws based on the social morality, and the way that laws are formulated also shape our morality, our conception of what is good and what is not okay, right? So these two things actually go hand in hand. Normally, when we say, and I'm asking this to all of you, normally when we say, what's the standard for limiting my freedom? What would be the answer?
Harm principle.
Yeah, harm principle, right? If the result of my action causes harm upon other parties, third-party harm, then my freedom can be restricted. That's the standard of normally criminalizing an activity or making an activity illegal. And the same or similar standard can actually be applied to our conception of morality. When my action causes tangible third-party harms to other people, we can say that's immoral. But when it doesn't have third-party harms, we have no reason to really call that an immoral act. So applying that standard into the second part of the case, does it create social harms upon other people? You have to link it back to the idea of prostitution. Because remember when we said that feminism debates are ultimately about choice debates, even if we assume that the individual prostitute is making a fully informed consent and her consent is meaningful. Even if that is the case, if the result of the prostitute consenting in entering the prostitution industry and being a prostitute causes third-party harms upon other people in the society, then we can still call that immoral, right? So how can we link it back to the idea of prostitution? How can you say that prostituting, is that a word? How can you say that that action causes social harm? How can you say that? Anyone?
Like
Yeah.
devalues family.
Huh?
Devalues family.
Devalues family?
Like the meaning of family.
Why?
Kind of, because
What if you're not married?
then like it leads to like object to
why is objectification of women bad to me? 어떤 막 제주도에 있는 그냥 막 태국에 있는 여자가 몸을 팔면 how does that affect me?
Well, because my lead men to see women as an object in general.
Yeah, exactly, right? It creates harm to other people because basically, and this is something that I learned in my feminism course, when we discuss prostitution, we can't think that prostitution is a completely isolated case from our daily lives. Because, for example, let's say that I have an older boyfriend. Let's say that my boyfriend is 12 years older than me. He's not, but let's assume that. And whenever we go on dates, my boyfriend, buys me full course. 막 점심도 사주고, 후식도 사주고, 저녁도 사주고, 저녁 먹고 또 후식을 먹어야 되니까 그것도 사주고, 그다음에 막 한잔하고, 한잔한 다음에 we go to a motel together and we spend the night there. If that happens, and I know that this happens to a lot of Korean young girls, right? If that happens, then can we say that my experience of being treated a full course meal and then having sexual relationship with him is completely cut off from the idea of prostitution? I don't think so. I think those things are on the same wavelength, and I think one is an extension of another. And when we're understanding social ills like prostitution, we also have to understand how, in general, our society shapes those kind of gender dynamics and how that affects everyone, right? So, like going back to the discussion we had discussing this, when we were talking about how 내 손님이 나한테 막 난 너 2시간 동안 너의 서비스를 했으니까 그 2시간 동안 넌 내가 시키는 거 아무거나 다 해야 돼 라고 얘기를 했으면 that kind of conception that if I paid for it, I can do anything I want with you is not going to be irrelevant to what the general public thinks or general male thinks, right? And the way that they shape their perception is obviously going to fall upon the young woman in our society, and it's unfair for the young woman because the way that I am viewed by male in society is shaped based on the actions of the prostitutes. And there's an unfair expectation that falls upon me to be sexualized or to consent to certain things that I never consented to. And that is bad because it limits ultimately my choice to have a certain identity in society or to do certain things without social taboo coming back at me, right? So ultimately, when I ran through you with what case I would run in this type of debate, ultimately you should realize that feminism debates, minority debates, or like morality debates in general are really all about how do we maximize choice for individuals, and ultimately you need to consider whether that individual is going to make a proper choice, but also whether the result of my choice affects the capacity of other people in the society to make a choice or not. 약간 삼천포로 빠지자면 제가 엄청 아이유 팬인데요. 아이유가 최근에 저랑 이름이 뭐지? 장기하랑 연애를 옛날에 시작했지만 최근에 그게 들켜졌잖아요. And I'm seeing all these like 잘 나가는 young idols in Korea society, like 수지, 아이유, and 막 다른 애들은 그냥 별로 안 중요하니까. 탑투만. Those people dating men that are much older than me, like 12 years plus minus older than them. 근데 진짜 막 좀 애매한 여자 아이돌도 아니고 제일 잘 나가는 여자 아이돌이 그렇게 나이 차이가 많은 남자들을 계속 만나니까 I think, of course, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have the freedom to do that. I'm not trying to restrict it or anything. Not that I can, even if I want to. That's not what I mean, but I think it does affect how like 삼촌 generation people in general are going to view young girls. 왜냐하면 아이유도 막 16살 이때 데뷔를 했고 수지도 고등학생 때 데뷔를 했고 when it comes to those idols, we have grown up with them and we have seen them, enter their adulthood and bloom into becoming like young women and everything. And if we already shared that process and they're dating like 30대 people, then I think other 삼촌 팬들 that are viewing that incident will think, 아 뭐야 장기하가 사귈 수 있으면 나도 뭐 이렇게 생각을 할 거고 그러면 20대 초반에 adult 여자애들뿐만 아니라 I think it's very easy for that perception to fall upon teenage girls because because we all know that they're 국민 여동생 and we've seen them from their late teenage years. And I think that's bad because it maybe encourages a culture of old guys dating young girls that are underage, and that being completely fine and normalized because Suji doesn't